So why was there no mention of what Jesus did from ages 12 to about 30? And did he go to India during that time and study? I'm answering your question. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. So we actually don't have very much of Jesus's life like before 12 either. You have his birth and him being sort of presented at the temple and then nothing. And why is that? Well, it's because the gospel writers each have a specific thing they're trying to communicate about Jesus. And during that time, Jesus was just likely doing what every kid did. He was going to school. He was learning things. So what did that schooling look like? Now, we don't have any direct writing about exactly what school was like during that time. A little bit later, it is formalized into a specific sort of schooling system. And a lot of times when something is formalized, it has grown out of something that was already being practiced. And so a guy named Ray Vander Laan sort of makes that connection, even though a lot of scholars would not just assume that. But what is formalized later is really interesting. So it begins like in elementary school with learning to read. And the way they learned to read was by reading the Bible and by memorizing the first 5 books of the Bible. That was about the amount of schooling that the girls had. And then the boys would continue on to talk about more of the Bible. And then the best of the best would end up in this wisdom school where they would be taught to apply the Bible in different ways to their life. The other thing that happened when they were later in their years was they would begin to learn the skill of their father. And so Jesus likely learned the trade of his father, but it's not the trade that you think it was. So a lot of people think that Joseph was a carpenter, he worked with wood. That's because some of the earliest translations of the Bible used that word. However, the word for Joseph's trade is the word tekton. And not many people worked with wood at that time. Tekton was generally a stonemason. And where Jesus lived, there was nearby a place called Sepphoris, where there was this massive building going on. And it was being built by stone. So likely, Jesus learned his father's trade, and Jesus was a stonemason, which interestingly means that Jesus very likely had big muscles from carrying stones and working with stones. But what about India? This idea begins with a guy named Nicholas Notovich. He wrote a book in the 1890s called The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, where he said that there was a text, a manuscript or a scroll that said that Jesus went to study in India/Tibet, and he said that this existed at this specific Tibetan monastery. So within a year, another scholar went to that monastery, to the guy who runs it, and said, hey, can I see this text? And the person at the monastery said, what are you talking about? That text doesn't exist. So it was debunked pretty quickly. But ideas like this can just capture people's imagination. They can take on a life of their own, even though they are just not true. Kind of like the idea that Constantine chose what books were in the Bible, even though that's not true. That's just from a novel called The Da Vinci Code. Why does this matter? Well, it matters quite likely because one of the reasons that none of that is really included in the stories of Jesus is because those writers were guessing that everybody would really know what Jesus had done as a child because he had a normal childhood. He learned how to read. He learned all of those things, and he learned his father's trade. And that's a really important concept in Christianity because this idea is that Jesus lived a normal childhood, a fully human life. And because of that, humans can identify with Jesus, and Jesus can identify with humans. God can identify with humans from a actual lived experience of being a human. And so Christians believe that this is part of the indication that God wants to have a relationship with humanity, and not just as some sort of detached deity, but from a real lived experience, from a real place of empathy. And that is really important to Christians.